Thank you, Daryl. It's good to see you.
Be here.
Next time, bring your papers. Be prepared.
Bring my papers.
Yeah, you said that you've done this so many times in the
Oh,
past.
no, it was a memorized canned speech, but
See, yeah.
I'll look over it next time before I come.
Item number 6, discussion and public hearing on the utility arboretum plan. I believe we've got another guest speaker here.
PowerPoint presentation, just to kind of quickly go through this. Okay, what I'm going to do here is just basically, and feel free to stop me at any point if you have any questions, if something doesn't make sense, just to kind of give you kind of a quick overview of what this item is about. This actually, probably the seed for this idea came back several years ago when LCUB was updating the utility lines basically in the area parallel with Grigsby Chapel Greenway. There were a lot of residents that were affected by that. I'm certainly not faulting LCUB. They had to do their job, but at any event, there were a lot of trees that were removed and or severely altered as a result of that project. So that's kind of how this came about, and I'll get a little bit more into that. The document's got 4 sections. The first is an introduction. It's basically what is the utility line arboretum. It's really just a demonstration project where we take plant material and we, in this context, try to highlight the importance of making good plant material selection, especially when you have overhead utility lines. That's what we're looking at with this arboretum. You could do an underground utility arboretum. That's certainly, people have done that. This one actually is for overhead utilities. Why is that important? Well, you know, it costs a lot of money to clear overhead utility lines. LCUB, I believe, spends over $500,000 a year just to keep their main high voltage lines clear. And that, obviously that cost is passed on to us as customers. So if you can kind of inform people and make them think about, you know, looking up or considering what's under the ground before they actually plant something, namely trees, you know, you can maybe head off some of these expenses. Of course, you know, trees that are planted under power lines, oftentimes they create power outages in a storm. You can help avoid public relations issues, you know, where the utility company, they're required by law to keep their lines clear. So they have to do that, but sometimes in the process of doing that, the end result is something that looks fairly unsightly. And it also can be very dangerous to trim around utility lines. If you have trees that are near overhead utility lines, children can get up in the trees and actually come in contact with the lines. That's obviously a hazard. Arcing can be a problem, which can create power outages and fires. Really just, you know, trees that are too large to be near overhead utilities, you know, really by the time they're trimmed, you've kind of defeated the purpose of having the tree there in the first place. And oftentimes you've created a weaker tree because the growth that comes back on that tree is inherently more likely to break, and there you got another potential, probably greater chance for a power outage. So all those things, trying to inform people, is what this utility line arboretum is trying to do. Here's an example of a tree that should not have been planted where it was. It's a Bradford pear right under the power line along the Kingston Pike. These are some other examples. Like I said earlier, the utility companies are required by law to keep their lines clear, and they need to do that. But oftentimes the end result is something that's probably undesirable to the community, or like this tree, obviously a potential fall hazard at some point. I mean, that's very likely to collapse onto the roadway at some point. So it's
Mark,
not a good situation.
Noticed the one on Smith Road by Ted, a house, big house on the left. You notice the one where they've cut the utility lines down and most of the trees hanging out in the road. I looked at it today and I'm thinking, why don't they just go ahead and cut the
Yeah.
tree down? Has anybody else seen it? You did?
That's a good picture to add, sounds like, yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, to the north?
John, you drive, his
Okay.
house is on the left and you continue driving and it really is a terrible eyesore to me.
I mean, you really defeated the purpose of planting that tree to start with a lot of times, because it's just butchered basically, and it just doesn't look good. So the objectives of this arboretum is, as I mentioned earlier, increase awareness of tree overhead utility line conflict, to improve tree selection, to actually provide people with visual examples of some utility appropriate trees. A secondary objective of this arboretum is to use native plant material, native trees, small, typically ornamental native trees. So we're trying to promote and increase the market demand for those type trees that are appropriate for utility lines that are unfortunately very underused in the urban landscape, to demonstrate planting conditions that are appropriate for different tree species. So by the time this is finished, we've got some areas that are shady, we got some areas that have moisture, and you can see which trees would be appropriate if you have those conditions on your property and you're considering planting a tree near an overhead line. And then to add an aesthetic, educational, informative element to the Grigsby Chapel Greenway, which we'll get to that here in a minute. With those objectives as kind of the background, the next step was to come up with a process for developing the arboretum. And the first thing you have to look at is, what are my planting parameters? What height do the trees need to stay under? What distance from the poles are we talking about? So you have these tree height zones. This was taken from the Arbor Day Foundation. This is actually on LCUB's website, and that's why I use this particular diagram, because I want to be consistent with our local power provider. So basically you have in this arboretum an area from the pole 20 feet out, and that's going to be your small tree zone, where trees that are planted in that area should not have a height at maturity of more than 25 feet. And then you have a medium height zone 20 to 50 feet away from the pole, where you've got trees that can grow up to 40 feet. And then beyond that, really, we don't really, we're not that concerned with the tree planting, because you're far enough away from the lines that it shouldn't be a problem normally. So that's the two zones, the A zone and the B zone, small tree and a medium tree, that this arboretum is focusing on. The next thing, with that kind of in mind, where would be a good place for the arboretum? And the things that I looked at when I was determining which site to choose was, I wanted an area that was publicly owned by the town of Farragut, an area that was highly visible, where there's a lot of people that would actually see this arboretum and thus learn about the importance of planting the right tree in the right location. An area where people have been impacted by the tree utility line conflict. As I mentioned earlier, Grigsby Chapel Greenway, much of that, the people were heavily impacted. An area that's fairly easy to access for planning and maintenance. It's not likely to be affected by future development. An area that is continuous but yet compact, and an area that's wide enough to where you have enough space to address the low and medium height zones that we looked at previously. And an area that has variable planting conditions so that you can demonstrate which plant material would do better in certain conditions. Well, there's a lot of factors that a site, it's going to be tough to select a site like that. And after looking at, namely the Grigsby Chapel Greenway, the best section that met all of that criteria to the greatest extent was a section that's mostly through Weatherly Hills. And this is the Grigsby Chapel Greenway. You can see the relatively new poles, LCUB, swapped out a few years ago. And you got the houses are back here. This property through here is pretty wide. It's owned by the town. The area to the east is owned by the town. And go to the next one. This is kind of a project location is. It's about 3/4 of a mile west of the Grigsby Chapel Greenway trailhead at the Park and Ride lot off Campbell Station Road. So that's roughly where it's at. This is the Weatherly Hills subdivision here, and it's basically on the eastern end of that. And I have met with Weatherly Hills, and they're very excited about it. They, you're getting some free tree planting down there, so it's but anyway, it's mostly going to be through this section. There's going to be a little bit of overlap over in this section, but again, this is all town of Farragut property. In fact, this whole piece here is the town. We're on the south side of the Greenway. Okay, now we've got a site selected. The next thing was, what kind of plants do I want to plant out there? As I mentioned earlier, we're looking at native trees. There's two objectives, major objectives with this. First, inform people of the utility line tree conflict, and secondly, promote native trees that are overhead utility line appropriate. So we're going with native trees tolerant of urban conditions, low maintenance, some trees that have notable visual appeal and interest, and a variety of species. Trees that can, survive in different conditions. The plant material in this section is going to be comparatively smaller than what you would see on a commercial site because some of these plants are sensitive to being transplanted, and I wanted to plant a little smaller material that would have a better chance of transplanting and thus in the long run do better. So that's, when you see that, some of them may look a little, smaller than you might think, but ideally we'd like to get material that's already locally acclimated to the conditions, space the material appropriately, keep the material far enough off of the path so that it doesn't grow up and create again, I'm thinking about what's this material going to look like in 20 years.